Over 100 years ago, deep in Czechoslovakia, along the Carpathian Mountains, there was a village in the mountains. And in this village lived a little girl, very badly thought of. Very badly thought of. She used to tease all the other children, boys and girls, about how they looked, how they dressed, how they walked, how they talked. And she used to do the same thing to the adults of the village. She would tease them, she would be disrespectful to them, she would curse at them, she would tell them that they were silly for believing in God, silly for believing in superstitions that this village contained. And she just never seemed to get along with anybody. She was just her own person. She had no friends. Her family didn't think too much of her, but they didn't quite know what to do with her. And one day, while she was taunting the other children and taunting the adults and just making a misery of the place, she stumbled upon an old woman who had a hard time walking, and she had this cane that she used to get around the village, and it was a knotted cane. It had little knots on it, like some kind of a mystical, intricate design, if you will. And she began to taunt that old woman and make fun of her, how she walked. And the old woman stopped dead in her tracks and pointed her bony finger at her and her knotted cane and uttered something in Slovak to her. And to the astonishment of the other villagers, they couldn't believe what she had just said to that little girl. They knew what she'd said. And they pleaded with that little girl, implored her, and said, "Please take back what you said about this old lady. You don't know who she is. And if something that she says to you is going to happen, it just may happen. And you might find something terrible fall upon you if you don't take back what you said." Well, she didn't believe any of that. She didn't believe in superstitions. Like I said, she didn't believe in the devil. She didn't believe in God. And she continued her taunt. And she continued her taunt with the other elder villagers who were standing around listening to this diatribe. After a few moments had passed, she left. She began to walk home. It began to grow dark. And the quickest way for her to get home was through the cemetery, the local cemetery where all the villagers who had passed on were buried. Well, she didn't think too much of that. She said, "I'll just pass through the graveyard and I'll get home." Suddenly, a very mysterious set of occurrences began to happen. First, the sky grew terribly discolored with black and green clouds mixing together, rushing up violent levels of thunder and lightning that continued to just pound the cemetery, knocking over tombstones, putting holes in the ground. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. But the lightning did not touch her. Well, this began to frighten her terribly. This is the first time she was probably ever scared in her life. And the only thing that appeased her was the fact that nobody was around that could see her in the state that she was in. Remember, she was this village bully, if you will. And she didn't want nobody to know that she could be scared. Then, after this rush of violence with lightning and thunder and the wind, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble and began to vibrate and began to feel like something underneath it was banging up, trying to get her attention. And she thought she was going to fall through the ground. All of a sudden, a very hot wind came that burned the whole entire front of her dress that she was wearing. And then it turned around with such a violent fury, and it blew towards her back, began biting her. It was so violent she fell to the ground, and she was out for a few minutes. At least it appeared that way. When she came to herself and grew conscious again, she saw the remnants of an old oak tree that was dying, and underneath that oak tree was standing a phantom of an old man, if you will, clad in black, skin as white as the clouds in the sky on a nice summer day, and bloodshot eyes as red as cherries. She was flabbergasted at this old man's appearance. He looked terrifying, and all he did was stand there under that oak tree and stare at her. He didn't move. Well, she couldn't move neither. She was just appalled by what she was encountering in the cemetery. It was just her and that man. Very lonely, very sad. Eventually, the people in the village saw less and less of her, until one day, out of nowhere, they went to a church one Sunday. This was a Catholic church. This was the only village in the church. It was all full of Catholic Slovaks. And as they approached their church, they saw writing on the door written in blood. And it said on the doors, "Cursed is the place that I was born forever." The villagers believed that the little girl became a disciple of the devil, and she vanished into the forest and somehow lived in the forest just to do and carry out the devil's wishes. Nobody had ever seen her no more, and she swore that the town that she was born in would be cursed forever. Nobody ever saw her again after some months had passed. But every now and then, on certain nights of the year, you could hear the crying of a little girl and the volcanic laughter of an old man. So, for you young ones out there who are going to go trick-or-treating this year, remember one thing. The person's door you knock on that does not wish to give you candy because they may not have any, or because they don't just believe in giving you candy, does not mean they're a mean person, and it does not mean that they don't believe in Halloween. But you better be careful on whose windows you decide to soak, because if you're not, you could end up never going trick-or-treating again because you won't be able to talk. Have a happy and safe Halloween.